Today's episode of The Noir Factory is brought to you by Crime Wave, a backstage look at the inner workings of a crime podcast. Crime Wave visits the first 12 episodes of The Noir Factory in a way you haven't seen before. Look for Crime Wave, available July 31st. And also, stay tuned during our commercial break for a promo for our friends at Once Upon a Crime. If true crime is your bread and butter and you're looking to add another great podcast, then look no further. He came from working-class parents who earned everything they ever got and were thankful for it. They scrimped and they saved, and they did their best for their family and for their community. And he knew from a very early age that he wanted none of that. Case number 34, Joseph Wheel, the Yellow Kid. Today on The Noir Factory.
Noir, suspense, true crime, hard-boiled fiction. Explore the dark alleys and cheap gin joints of mob history, noir films, hard-boiled paperbacks, and two-fisted pulp fiction with mystery writer and make-believe detective Stephen Gomez. Grab your fedora and button your lip as you enter the office of the internet's finest fictional detective agency, the Noir Factory.
Who's going to believe a con artist? Everyone, if she's good. Andy Griffith. Joseph Wheel was born in Chicago in 1875 to Mr. and Mrs. Otto Wheel. The couple owned a small neighborhood grocery store, and they made a decent income. Their boy, Joseph, helped out after school by sweeping up and stocking shelves. And then he discovered racehorses. He quit school at 17 to work as a debt collector. And while he was successful at collections, it was observations that were really his specialty. At the end of the day, when he turned in his collections, he noticed that his fellow collectors were always a little short. The collections went to bookkeepers, who in turn were a little short on their offerings as well. Will let his fellow workers know that he had noticed these inconsistencies, and he hinted that others might be interested in that observation as well. Soon, he was a recipient of 10% of said inconsistencies. And while Will's fortunes took a temporary upturn, he couldn't really count on blackmailing his co-workers as a long-term business model. Nor did he have to. At the racetrack, he met Doc Merriweather, a huckster of legendary status. Dressed all in black with black tie and tails, wearing pince-nez glasses, and sporting a Van Dyke beard, he was a man who made it hard to miss him. He found a kindred spirit in Wheel, and he offered Wheel 3 times what he made from his collections job to come work for him. Wheel had no idea what the work was, but he was captivated by the character, and he took the job. Doc Merriweather sold Merriweather's Elixir, a cure for whatever ails you, be you man or beast. Merriweather said his elixir was particularly effective on tapeworms, which was a major concern of the day. The elixir was made in a factory on the west ends of Chicago, and it consisted mainly of rainwater and alcohol, with some coloring and flavoring added. Merriweather sold his elixir out of a wagon, where he ran an honest-to-goodness medicine show, complete with dancing girls and a small stage for the doctor. Will would serve whatever role was needed. If they needed a barker, he fit the bill. If they needed him to run errands, he ran errands. But he was best served as a plant in the audience. "I'll take 2 bottles, sir," Will would say. 2 bottles? Why, 1 is more than enough to do the job. "I know, sir. It's for my 2 children." "Have you used this preparation before?" "Indeed I have, doctor. In fact, I owe my life to it." "Would you mind telling us about it?" asked Merriweather. Will did, and he painted an epic picture of near death and a miraculous return to health. After the elixir saved his life, it turned him into a virtual Superman. The elixir flew off the shelves, and for those who required extra care for their mostly imagined tapeworm, Doc Merriweather was willing to cure them as well. The patient was required to work with a basin filled with water. At the bottom of the water, a tapeworm would be produced for them to see, proving the parasite was no longer with them. The tapeworm in question was a long spiral-cut potato peel, which looked particularly to someone who had never seen one like a tapeworm. After selling his wares, Merriweather accepted the heartfelt thanks from the crowd and he left to the sound of applause, usually before any refunds could be requested. Weil left the employment of Doc Merriweather soon afterwards, and he joined a man who was working magazine subscription scams. Weil took the scam and he ran with it, selling 6-year subscriptions with free silverware settings. He also talked farmers into buying antique eyewear and exotic wristwatches. This time in Weil's life kind of set the stage for how he would continue to work. He spent his career working with some of the biggest names in the confidence game in a manner that would set him up as a Robin Hood type character, if to nobody but himself. Weil toured with his partner for the season with his magazine subscriptions before returning to Chicago, richer than he'd ever been before. In just a few days, the Noir Factory will be featuring a brand new look into what we do here at the agency, and we couldn't be more proud. Crime Wave is a collection of the first 12 cases of the Noir Factory podcast in book form. What this amounts to is a backstage look at true crime podcasts in general, and the Noir Factory in particular. Get into our heads to find out what we look for in a case, how we go about our research, and how we get to the heart of every story. Crime Wave is a collection of our first steps as a podcast, as well as the stories that help us find our voice. If you're a fan of the show, if you're a fan of crime podcasts, if you just like a good story, pick up a copy of Crime Wave, available on Amazon as a Kindle ebook or a trade paperback. And in addition to our new look of our first cases, you'll get a bonus taste of the Noir Factory fiction with our first case of the John Brightman casebook. That's Crime Wave by Stephen Gomez, a Noir Factory exclusive, available July 31st as an ebook or trade paperback on Amazon. And now, a word from our friends at Once Upon a Crime podcast.
This is Esther, host of Once Upon a Crime, a podcast that shares true crime stories chapter by chapter. Crimes are covered within series like, we're in the series Monstrous Moms and Dastardly Dads. This is Chapter 2, John List. Killer Kids, Chapter 1, Jesse Pomeroy. Murder in Paradise, Chapter 3, Missing in Aruba. This is Chapter 1, A Woman Scorned, Betty Broderick. As a storyteller, I share not only the details of the crime, but also my research into the backgrounds of the victims and perpetrators to try to understand why events unfolded as they did and to offer clues into how and why these crimes occurred. You can find more about the show on truecrimepodcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Joseph Weil returned to Chicago, and he married his fiancée, Jessie, a religious woman who believed that her husband was a traveling salesman. Weil accompanied his wife to church and struck up a relationship with a pastor. The pastor encouraged Weil to take up reading, to study, and to improve his education. Weil took the pastor's advice to heart, but I can't help feel it wasn't in the vein in which it was intended. Joseph Weil studied various books on religion and philosophy, but in the end, he used them to justify what he already believed. Those who wanted something for nothing deserved to get nothing for something. In Chicago, he ran horse racing scams where he put on his horse rig as collateral on a fixed race scheme. In each instance, he lost the rig to the mark, but the expenses of the race caused the men to pay out $7,000 to win a $500 horse rig. In one case, at least according to the autobiography of a con man, Weil met a man who owned a chain of restaurants in the Chicago area. He asked the man for $2,500 to place on a fixed race that he guaranteed. According to Weil, the man refused to be involved with horse racing, fixed or otherwise. But he offered to loan Weil the money if he truly needed it. Weil turned the man down. He refused to take a cent, calling the man the only man he'd ever met who was 100% honest. Around the time the racehorse con was drying up, Weil and his friend Frank Hogan, another grifter, ran a few small barroom cons in Chicago. One was in a saloon owned by Bathhouse John Coughlin. The two conned a guy out of $28, and the con didn't sit right with Coughlin. Referring to a popular comic strip called Hogan's Alley and the Yellow Kid, he tagged Weil, who hung out with Frank Hogan, as the Yellow Kid. It was a nickname that stayed with Weil for the rest of his life. Weil and Hogan went their separate ways soon after, with Hogan moving on to stock trading. Wheel went into business with Billy Wall, another confidence man in Chicago. They ran an ad in a local newspaper that read, "Wanted. Man to invest $2,500. Opportunity to participate in a very profitable venture. Confidential, box W62, in care of this paper." Wheel actually received quite a few responses, which he filed away for future use. They settled on a man Wheel called Marcus McAllister. McAllister was a wealthy owner of one of Chicago's leading playhouses, and a leading financier of what would eventually become the White City, the setting for Chicago World's Fair. Wheel told McAllister that his brother-in-law was in debt and under the thumb of loan sharks. He was an honest fellow, and he worked with racehorses, and he had inside knowledge on the outcomes of certain races. Wheel told McAllister that with his help, he could get his brother-in-law to reveal the outcome and settle with the loan sharks, as well as make them money. After some convincing, McAllister agreed, and the two met Billy Wall, Wheel's brother-in-law. They arranged for a signal to be sent via telegraph to a bar with a betting cage. McAllister and Wheel sat and they waited for the message from Wall. The message came, Colorado to win, and McAllister went to place his bet. The bar was crowded with patrons and workers, and when it came time for McAllister to actually place his bet, a barroom fight broke out, and it prevented him from placing the bet. The two men listened as the results came in. Colorado won. With a righteous fury, Wheel demanded that the situation be made right, telling the cashier they cost his friend $10,000. "What do you want me to do?" asked the cashier. "I don't control who gets into fights." No, he didn't. It was Wheel who controlled who got into fights. Every person, from the man taking the money to the fools taking the punch, were on the payroll of Wall and Wheel. Swearing never to set foot in such an establishment again, McAllister and Wheel left without making a cent. And if McAllister checked an independent source to see who won the race, he would have found Colorado the winner. He just never checked the clock on the wall of the bar. The race was over by the time McAllister was ready to place his bet. Learning that Wall and Wheel had indeed given him the correct info, McAllister agreed to pay the $7,500 agreed upon, with the understanding that as soon as the heat was off, they would bring another scheme to him. Wall and Wheel agreed, and after paying off all involved, the two split the $7,000. Weeks later, Wheel would contact McAllister and tell him about a device that would tap into telegraph lines and intercept the information before letting it go back to the line, thereby letting them know which horse had won before the betting parlors. It would make them all a small fortune, at least according to Wheel. Wheel and his associates brought McAllister to a dingy part of town, and they showed him their device, a wiretapping tool. It was a large box that weighed a ton. Inside lay wires and switches and connections, and by all accounts, the device looked like quite a feat of technological brilliance. And it did absolutely nothing. McAllister paid handsomely for the grift, as did others, and they even begged for more. As the Chicago scams got old, Wall and Wheel went their separate ways. In order to keep any repercussions from reaching him, Wheel left for Louisville for a few weeks. When he got back to Chicago, the first person he ran into was McAllister. Telling McAllister that he was found out and had to leave town, Wheel borrowed $500 from his former mark and bid him good day. In Chicago, Wheel went about well-dressed and with a bit of flash. He wore a 5-carat diamond ring and a pocket watch with a diamond-studded horseshoe. By this time, he owned a few racehorses himself, although he didn't bet on them. He continued to grift his way through Chicago, always brazen and always showy, but he never really ran into any trouble with the law or his former victims. The law on confidence crimes, Wheel explained in his autobiography, were different then. They only applied to those who were conned through ways they could not foresee as being dishonest. It was hard to make a case for unforeseen dishonesty when the object of the endeavor is to fix a horse race. In fact, the Yellow Kid felt there was a pecking order to con men. In one case, a guy named Sidman Engel, who was known as Chicago's marrying swindler, was being charged for fraud. Wheel told his friends, "Preying on the love of women for money is one of the most despicable ways of making a livelihood I ever heard of." Wheel moved from horse racing to real estate, and his props grew with his grifts. He rode in limousines, and he was a member in good standing of the American Turf Association. Throughout most of his career, Wheel stayed on good terms with the police. Once he was accused of murder in the local papers. After obtaining an attorney and meeting with the witnesses, a less than scrupulous move, Wheel was not only cleared, but apologized to in print. On the police force, there was even some sort of begrudged respect for the Yellow Kid, and he continued his practice to cheat others who wanted to game the system. During World War I, Wheel and conman Frederick Buckmeister swindled a banker out of $100,000 by selling him fake stock in an Indiana steel mill, by posing as representatives of German interests. At the time, in the middle of World War I, it was considered embarrassing to go into business with German businessmen. He was also known for taking money from banks and other financial establishments. In 1917, he posted as English broker and bilked a bank out of $15,000. In another, he opened no less than 6 phony brokerages with counterfeit stationery from J.P. Morgan. On more than one occasion, he rented an office building and he hired staff to turn the business into a bank just to dress up one of his scams. He staged fake prize fights to swindle bettors. He seeded fake gold fields with real gold. He sold oil fields he didn't own. And he once sold a talking dog that surprisingly didn't talk. In fact, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was reputed to have brought some non-existent land from him in the neighborhood of $2 million. Still, the case that garnered the most headlines was that of the Little Sisters of the Poor. In 1949, Wheel stole a check for $3 that he collected for the Little Sisters of the Poor. And the case was thrown out on a technicality, and Wheel told the judge that it was a mistake and he would happily pay the nuns for the money. The judge told Wheel he'd be happy to give him a year in Bridgewell if the case hadn't been submitted on improper charges. And despite his clean reputation and good press, Wheel was not a stranger to the hospitality of the criminal justice system. He usually made the best out of it. In 1928, he spent the holidays in federal prison in Leavenworth. He sent out letters to his fellow Chicagoans, asking for funds for his fellow inmates to celebrate the Passover holiday. He signed each letter Joseph Wheel, president of the Jewish congregation. In 1925, he was arrested for passing bad checks, and a doctor from the psychopathic laboratory ruled that Wheel had the intelligence of a 16-year-old. The report called him foppish, a moral imbecile, and said that he possessed a busy brain that is eternally plotting against somebody, but unaware that injury is being done to others. Wheel told the judge with glee that he couldn't defend himself. The very learned Dr. Hickson says I have the mentality of a 16-year-old child. He was sentenced to 30 days. The only thing that was able to stop the Yellow Kid from doing business in Chicago was the Yellow Kid. His adventures were so grandiose, his legend was so big that there was not a single cop in America that didn't know the famous Joseph Wheel. He became so well known, he could not continue the grift. Wheel was always rather philosophical about his life. He once owned a hotel on Sheridan Road that he lost because he failed to make a loan payment. He once told a reporter for the Chicago Tribune that life is a funny proposition after all. We're born, we live a little while, and then someone forecloses on the mortgage. Joseph Wheel, the Yellow Kid, passed away in Chicago in 1976 at the age of 100. He's buried at the Mount Glenwood Memorial Garden in Willow Springs, Illinois. That closes the books on this case. Join us next time on the wrong side of the tracks at the Noir Factory, as we look at the best in true crime, noir, and hard-boiled stories has to offer. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please subscribe on iTunes and leave an honest review. And be sure to stop by the website to fill up on pulpy and hard-boiled goodness. And remember, nice guys finish last.
Psst, still there? This week's special Noir Factory Dakota message is coming right up. Crack the code by visiting thenoirfactory.com/key.
16, 22, 4, 9, 23, 22. That is all. For the key to this code, visit thenoirfactory.com/key. That's thenoirfactory.com/key. Good night.